of Johannesburg's workshop on research methodology, qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods at the College of Business and Economics. My name is Dr. Lorenzo David, and I will be your facilitator for today. I would like to start off by thanking all of our attendees for taking the time to join us. Most importantly, we'd also like to thank our presenter, Dr. Nicholas Stradum, for his effort with preparing and giving this presentation. Before introducing Dr. Nicholas Stradum to you, I'd like to go over some housekeeping rules and some important information. For the housekeeping rules, if you do have questions during the presentation, please raise your hand if you would like to speak, or alternatively, you could type your question into the chat box. I will then indicate to the presenter to address the question. Just for our information, the session is being recorded and the presentation slides will be requested from the presenter. Both of these will be uploaded to the Moodle communities by the end of the week. A feedback survey will be sent during the session on the chat section. We would greatly appreciate it if you could, and request you to please fill this out for us to gain insight on whether this workshop was useful and how we can improve our service in the future, as well as to provide kind words to the facilitator for all of their hard work. This will be used for the facilitators and RCD's reporting. By filling out the survey, this also ensures that you receive a certificate of attendance via our RCD management system, which is currently being integrated into ULink. When it's up in the system, we will notify you to generate your certificates. So I'd just like to quickly introduce Dr. Nicholas Stradum, once again thanking him for the effort in preparing this presentation. Dr. Nicholas Stradum is a lecturer at the Department of Accountancy. He holds a Master in Commerce in Financial Management from the University of Johannesburg with a dissertation entitled A Historical Analysis of Electronic Trading System Implementation, the Case of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and a PhD in Finance from the University of Johannesburg with a thesis entitled Stock Exchange Legitimacy, the Case for Johannesburg Stock Exchange between 1887 and 1945. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Dr. Stradum. The floor is yours, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks. It's lovely to be with you guys this morning. I can see we have a few attendees in the room as well, so I welcome you as well. Okay, so let's jump in. I'm just going to share my slides with you. If you'll give me 1 second. Okay, just to double check, you can all see my my slides, right?
Yes, Doc, your slides are visible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Okay, cool. So the title of the workshop is Research Methodology, Qualitative, Quantitative, and Mixed Methods. So I'm going to just take you through a little bit of a journey so we can explore this together. You know, what is qualitative research? What is quantitative research? What is mixed methods, and when do we decide which way to go? Okay, so my understanding is that many of you are sort of in the early stages of your research, you know, preparing to do research, maybe working on proposals. So I'll keep that in mind as we go along. Okay. Yeah, my name is Nicholas, as you've heard from the very kind introduction. Yeah, that's me. Okay, so as I said, welcome to the workshop. We're going to look at interesting aspects of the methodology together. I'm at the Department of Accountancy in CBE, and my background, as you have heard before, is in finance. I think I'm maybe a little bit of an uncommon type of person in the finance space because I do qualitative research in finance, which is not very common. So many of my students, fortunately, who I supervise are doing quantitative research. So I have a good idea of what's going on in both of those spaces. So hopefully I can share that with you today. Okay, so what are we going to look at today? I just have a short agenda for us. So just the introduction, which we have gone through now. Then I'm going to give you an overview of quantitative research, followed by an overview of qualitative research. And then we are sort of going to look at the bigger picture of how qualitative and quantitative research differs and sort of the similarities between them as well. Also, we are going to dive a little bit into mixed methods research. I'm just going to give you an overview of that. And then we are going to spend a little bit of time thinking about how to make a choice about your methodological approach. Okay, there's a few things you can consider that I do with my own students, and I think it's very helpful for them as well. I'll show you one or two practical examples, and then at the end, if you have any questions, we can have a bit of a discussion as well. Okay. If you have questions throughout the presentation, you're more than welcome to let me know. I might not get to it immediately, but even if you want to, write your question in the chat and just leave it there, then I will make sure that I get around to all of the questions. Okay. So just before we start, I just want to hear from the participants as well. If you can maybe let me know in the chat, what level of study are you busy with? So are you busy with master's or doctoral, or maybe after your doctorate, you're busy with research? And the second thing that I want to know is, which type of research do you anticipate doing? Do you think you want to do more quantitative? Do you think qualitative? Are you considering mixed methods? So you can just give me in the chat a little short piece of text. So, in my case, it would be doctoral and qualitative, or, something like that. Okay, so I'm going to just stop sharing so I can have a look at the chat. I'll just give you a minute to do that. I just want to get a sense of, where you are and try to accommodate everybody by looking at what your focus is. Okay, I can see people are starting to type. If you don't know yet, that's also more than fine. Okay, it's just if you have an idea of where you want to focus your attention. Okay, we have Julia saying PhD mixed method. Okay, that's great. Tapiwa is saying PhD qualitative. That's okay, that's nice. That's sort of similar to what I did. Very nice. Okay, I think let's proceed. The rest of you, if you have a moment, you can maybe let me know what level of study you are at. But I'm going to assume for the most part, I think we will be, we will have PhD students. Okay. Right. So before we jump into the specifics, I just want to set the scene for you a little bit. It's something that we are all busy with, whether you are at master's level or PhD level, or whether you are doing continuous research. We do research all the time, but we never stop to think really what is it about. So the question is, what is academic research? Let's pull the definition apart a little bit so we can set the scene for you. Okay. So one definition by the OECD says it's creative work. Take note, a lot of more quantitative-minded researchers don't think it's creative, but it's still a creative process. Okay, creative work undertaken on a systematic basis. This is where your methodology becomes very important, because you have to demonstrate exactly how you approach your research in order to increase the stock of knowledge, including the knowledge of man, culture, and society, and the use of this stock of knowledge to devise new applications. Okay. It's quite a big definition, but you can see there are some key elements: creative work, systematic basis, and then knowledge of a variety of different things. Okay. The second definition that we can have a look at is from these authors, which you can see on the screen. So they said, research is an activity that we all undertake to learn more about our environment and the impact we have on it. Okay. Whether you are in economics or finance or law or humanities, whatever the case might be, this is always the underlying principle that we follow. So that we want to learn more about our environment. What does that imply? It says to us, we have to have an eye on the real world. We don't want a research problem that is so complicated and so niche that it will have no bearing on the real world. Okay. And then if you look at the origin of the word, etymology of the word research comes from a Middle French word, which you can see on your screen. I don't speak French, so I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but it means to go about seeking. And I think sometimes we forget that it's a process of seeking, I see this with my own students as well. They want to spend a few days, design a research a project and then execute it, and then it's finished. And it never works like that. You have to go and search far and wide. You have to adapt your idea as you go along. And what I want to emphasize here is that that is a normal part of the process. It's something that everybody goes through. You have to really spend. I think it normally takes a bit longer than we anticipate. To really get a good sense of how to approach a problem, what the core essence of the problem is, and how you're going to solve that problem. Okay, that is inherent in the research process. Then just a few thoughts on the nature of research. I think sometimes we forget this as well, and I include myself in this as well. Research is about discovery, right? It's about learning new things. I sometimes had the sense when I was busy with my PhD that, it sounds strange to say it, but I almost felt like I was the only person in the world who knew these particular things. And I thought that was such a great feeling to have, and it's something that you need to hold on to when you are working with a PhD, because it's nice to think that you are creating knowledge, and you are almost at the forefront of a particular topic. Sometimes you feel like you're completely lost, but then sometimes it really feels like you have discovered something interesting. Okay. So I think that's a very important thing to hold on to. If we look at the opposite, research is not the collection and presentation of information. Okay. What's the key word here? It's interpretation. Okay. If we just have a document with a collection of information that's just presented there, it doesn't have life. It doesn't have as much value as something where you have brought your own interpretation, your own view on a particular thing. Okay. So because there is interpretation, that leads to maybe disagreement, maybe there will be some criticism. Perhaps the way you see things, people don't agree with, and I guess we could call that an error, although that is also a whole discussion for another day. But the point that I'm trying to make is this is a natural part of research. It's important for you to consider your own voice as well. Okay. Don't be afraid of criticism. I think whether you go the quantitative route, the qualitative route, whether you do mixed methods, there will always be someone who thinks that you can do your research in a different way or in a better way. But what I want to say to you is, if you can substantiate your approach from literature, you can show how your study fits into the bigger picture, then you always have a foot to stand on. Okay. So that's why I've said here, a strong methodology shields you from criticism. Okay. Doesn't matter if you do quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods. If you have a strong, systematic, well-substantiated methodology, that really shields you from a lot of issues. Okay. So if we look at a quote by Ryan and co-authors, it says, in order to make a worthwhile contribution, however, we need to remember that the research process is as important as the output. Okay. Especially for PhD students, there's always the thoughts about, what is your contribution? If you are at a conference, if you are presenting to maybe at the department, the question always comes up, what is your contribution? How are you going to contribute to academic literature? And something that we forget is often your contribution is methodological, right? Obviously, you will have your results that come out of your study that maybe have some practical policy implications or theoretical implications. But oftentimes we neglect the value of a methodological contribution. If you approach a familiar problem in a new methodological way, that is definitely a contribution. Okay, so that's maybe something to consider as you are working on your research idea or research proposal, depending on which stage you're at. Okay. Why do we do academic research? I stumbled upon this three worlds theory by Mouton, who I think is affiliated with Stellenbosch University. And that sort of summarizes it very well for me. Okay, we have these three different worlds that sort of intersect. Okay, we have the world of everyday life. This is, your personal life, the real world, I guess you could say, where we live and we meet with other people and we interact with society. Then we have the world of science. Okay, that is research, all these complicated things that we busy ourselves with at the university and in other contexts as well. And then you have the world of meta science. That is the science of science. This is, I guess you could say, the research methodology world. It's our thinking about research. Okay. And we need to make sure that all three of these worlds intersect with each other, overlap with each other, so that we have good, valuable, trustworthy research. Okay. If we only have an overlap between two of the different worlds, then it becomes a bit of a problem, right? You can see if we don't have an overlap of all three, it might be that there is unreliable and useless knowledge, right? If something is not rooted really in meta science, if meta science is excluded, okay. If you don't approach it in a systematic way, okay. It might be that we have reliable research with no real-world application. If we take a scientific problem and we apply good scientific practices to it, but we forget about the everyday life, it means that we have great research, but it has no real-world application and it doesn't have any bearing on everyday life. Okay. And if we have a problem and we have interesting thinking about it, we approach it in a systematic way, but we forget about the scientific aspects, then it's philosophy or maybe thought experiments. Okay, so I think you can all see that we want these three elements to intersect. We want to have a good scientific principles, go out and observe and where possible, measure things. We want to approach it in a systematic way, and we want to make sure that it is relevant to everyday life so that other people might also find it useful. Okay. This is just a way of sort of thinking about research that I think is quite handy. Okay, so let's jump into a bit more detail. If we talk about quantitative research first, right? So I've purposefully started off with quantitative research, and because I am more of a qualitative researcher, and I don't want people to get the idea that I don't like quantitative research. I certainly think that it has a place in academic research, and I think it delivers a lot of interesting insights. So okay, before we start with quantitative, I just want to have a quick look if there are any questions in the chat. Okay, no questions so far. I see James as well. James has said PhD mixed methods. Fantastic. Okay, so there's a lot of interest in mixed methods, which I think is very interesting. Okay. Right, so let's jump back into the slides. All right, so quantitative research. I think you can tell from the name, if you look at this part, quant, what does that suggest? It's research to do with numbers. Okay, some aspects of society or economy or physical properties, whatever it might be, that can be quantified. Okay, so let's look at the more formal definition. So the definition here of quantitative research is that it involves the systematic investigation of phenomena by gathering quantifiable numerical data, right? And then going and doing some statistical, mathematical, or some computational techniques. Okay. In my field, for example, it happens sometimes that people will calculate a bunch of ratios. If you are doing sort of an accounting or finance type of analysis. So the basis here, obviously, is when the data that you're using is numerical, okay, or quantifiable in some way. What's the purpose of quantitative research? So we want to quantify a problem by generating or gathering numerical data or data that can be transformed into usable statistics. Okay, so you can see sort of on the right-hand side of the screen here, there are different, I guess, statistical outputs, and then people are trying to figure out what is happening here. We are getting a sense of what's happening in the data, and then we base our discussions on that. Okay. Then what are the key characteristics of quantitative research to keep in mind? Okay. If you are doing qualitative, or if you are considering, doing mixed method, this might not be entirely relevant to you, but I still think it's a good idea for you to have the spectrum of quantitative, qualitative in your head, just so that you can always test where you are and make sure you are still on the right track. Okay, so let's jump into the key characteristics. The first and most obvious one is numerical data, right? If you do quantitative research, you're going to collect and analyze numerical data. That is the basis of quantitative research. The second key characteristic is objectivity, right? The focus is as far as possible on maintaining objectivity and minimizing researcher bias. Now, I think for those of you who have done quantitative research before, you will know that even if you use, complicated statistical tests or, econometric models or things like that, there is always some level of interpretation that you have to make, and there is, some degree of choice that you have in which variables you use, which models you are going to use, how to interpret the results, creating the meaning of the results. So the idea here is that the focus is more on objectivity, but it's not always possible to have perfect objectivity, and that is fine. That is something that everybody understands about quantitative research, and that you should also keep in mind when you are engaging with quantitative research. Okay. I think your supervisors might have also told you this, but if you read a paper and it's quantitative, we can't, on the basis of it being quantitative, accept it as the pure absolute truth. We still have to be critical about it. We have to see, that they, are they clear about the research procedures? How did they select the variables and all that? Okay. So the ideal is objectivity. That is what we strive towards, but it's not always perfect. Okay. Then statistical analysis, that is another key quantitative research characteristic. You are going to use statistical tools and techniques. In my department, there are a lot of people who do, sort of econometric type of research where you look at financial markets and you look at time series, those type of analyses. I think that is a relatively common feature. I think perhaps in other contexts, maybe it will be more cross-sectional, but in our department, I guess it's more time series based. Okay. Nonetheless, for quantitative research, we have typically large sample sizes. So because you have this, this opportunity of quantifying the phenomenon that you're looking at, it often enables you to have larger sample sizes. You will see if you look at the typical qualitative research that, there won't be a huge sample of thousands and thousands of participants. If you think about a survey, for example, which is more on the quantitative side, it might have thousands of respondents, whereas a study that is based in interviews, which is more qualitative, that will have maybe a smaller sample size, maybe 20 or 30 people. Okay. Then for the next one, for quantitative research, there's very structured methods, right? The data is also structured. It's divided neatly. It's categorized. If you use secondary data, if you download industry data or maybe company specific data, it's all relatively standardized and structured. You know exactly where to find what you're looking for. So that's typical of surveys, experiments, even questionnaires, which you have to devise yourself. You are going to divide it up and structure it nicely so that the analysis can also be structured. Okay. Typically, we will do then some form of hypothesis testing. So we are going to think about, or engage with the literature, devise one or more hypotheses, and then test them through our statistical analysis. There's a high degree of replicability, so other researchers can then come and replicate your study and see if they get the same results. And through this replication, we get closer to a more complete picture of a particular phenomenon. Okay. Generalizability is obviously because of the replicability and the systematic way that we do it, the generalizability is higher. So the aim that we have is to take our findings and relate it to a broader population. Okay. You'll see that is quite a key characteristic where qualitative research is also different, because the aim for qualitative research is not really generalizability. Okay, but we'll get to that in a minute. Okay. We have quantifiable variables, which we have spoken about if we have numerical data. And then the last point that you can see over here is predictive power. This is something that is also sort of a benefit of quantitative research. If you have established particular trends or patterns, you can then go and use your statistical model or the analysis that you have constructed and use it for its predictive power. So then you can kind of extrapolate into the future, and based on what has happened in the past, you can make some kind of an estimate of what might happen going forward. Okay. Now, obviously, none of us have a crystal ball. We can't see into the future. So this is only an estimation, but still, if we get some insight into the trends and the patterns, then that really enables us to have a picture of how things might play out going forward. Okay, but that's sort of an overview of the key characteristics. There are certain pros, or if you want to call it advantages or benefits of quantitative research. And then there are some disadvantages as well, which we'll look at in a second. So the pros, or the good things about quantitative research, the first thing is objectivity, as we have mentioned before. Although there is still some level of interpretation, you can rely quite heavily on statistical tests. So if your p-values are in the correct range, something is statistically significant, then it helps you to figure out, what is the implications of your findings. Okay, it reduces personal bias and subjectivity to some extent. I don't think it eliminates it completely, but still, if you do something in a structured way, and you follow the procedures of the statistical test, it really helps you to reduce that personal bias. Okay. The second one is generalizability. If you have obviously a large sample, the benefit is that you can then extend that to the broader population. So you don't have to ask every single person in the country, for example. You can just have a sample, and then you get a sense of what that picture looks like for the broader population. Okay. The third pro or advantage is precision. So because of the structured and precise nature of the data that we use, it allows us for a very precise analysis. You'll see if we look at Qualitative, again, there's a bit of a difference there. The idea there is not necessarily precision, but it's more, the richness of the data and the detail that we are looking at. Okay, replicability is the next advantage. So obviously, as we have mentioned before, if you do your analysis in a very structured way and you are transparent about your approach and your sources of data, that enables other researchers to go and test it. Okay, some people fear this a lot. I know, just the general sense of my colleagues in academia, people are scared when somebody else is engaging with your research. I always say, if somebody else is replicating your study or they are engaging with your study, first of all, they have to cite you, right? Which is a good thing. So you are getting some recognition. And then the second thing is, if somebody engages with your research and they take it a step further, maybe they approach it in a slightly different way, ultimately it's a benefit for society because we are getting closer and closer to a better, more comprehensive answer about a particular question. Okay, so don't be scared if somebody is engaging with your data. It's a normal part of doing research, especially in quantitative research. Okay. Then for statistical analysis, obviously, another advantage of quantitative research is that we can use a wide variety of statistical techniques depending on the problem that you're trying to solve. So there's really a lot of tools that you can use if you're doing quantitative research. Okay. And then I guess the final advantage that I want to highlight is the clear and concise results that you get from quantitative research. I think if I can give you an example from my own life, if you look at the typical quantitative type research that you would get in the finance context, it's short and to the point. It's mostly academic papers. They are 15 pages long and they give you all of the statistics and the cycles and all those lovely things, and you get a very definite answer. If I look at my doctoral research, for example, where I looked at the history or the historical development of the stock market, in that field, the typical way that people produce research output would be in book form, because if you think about a 20 or 30 or 50 or 100-year development of an organization or some kind of aspect of society, there's normally more to say than 15 pages. It's more about the detail. Okay, that is also, I don't think it's a disadvantage necessarily if you want to go into more detail. It's just a different approach. Okay, in the case of quantitative research, it is an advantage because it gives us short, easily digestible results, which we can then go and test further, or we can implement it in some way. Okay, cons. This is maybe the, I guess, disadvantages of quantitative research. So the first one, which is something that is addressed by qualitative research, the first one is there's to some degree limited contextual understanding. Okay. This type of research focuses on the numbers, on things that are measurable. So we sometimes neglect, context, complexity, essentially everything that doesn't fit into that statistical model. We are going to completely ignore and exclude, which, depending on what you are trying to accomplish, is fine. But it's something that qualitative research is then very good for. And if you are thinking about mixed method research, then naturally, you are almost getting the benefits of quantitative and qualitative, right? Okay. The second disadvantage, I guess you could say, is a lack of flexibility, right? Because everything is so structured. We have these numerical, quantitative variables. We can't really adjust it as we go along. If we stumble upon new things, it's structured. There's a particular procedure that we follow, and then we get our results. Okay. I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing, but it's just inherent in the way that quantitative research is done. If you look at qualitative research again, there is more flexibility. If you have interviews with people, for example, then you could ask follow-up questions, or if you discover something completely new that wasn't part of the literature, you can go and pursue it, right? Which is not always necessarily the case or the objective of quantitative research. Okay. The third one, that I guess this is kind of related to the second point. There is an inability to explore meaning, right? So with quantitative research, you want to go and measure a particular phenomena, and you want to see if there's a relationship or some kind of association between them, which you can mathematically demonstrate. But that doesn't really leave meaning for the underlying reasons, the meanings that people ascribe to that. And again, this is not a reason to not do quantitative research. It's just something that you have to keep in mind. And if this is a problem for you, for your particular research problem that you're trying to solve, then you could maybe consider qualitative research. Okay. Right. Then assumptions of objectivity, as I've mentioned before, we always strive for objectivity, but that is not always 100% possible, because the researcher still has a particular view of the world, maybe some biases that we approach our data with. So it's not a perfect objectivity. Although I think if you approach it in a structured way, a systematic way, then that eliminates many of the problems associated with this. Okay. The second last one, there's a risk of oversimplification. Sometimes if we take something very complicated and we reduce it down to numerical data, sometimes we lose a little bit of the complexity and the detail, right? Not to say that quantitative research is less valuable because of this, but it's almost the price that we pay for a large data set and for the structured way in which we approach it, is that we have to some degree, simplify the issue that we are looking at. Okay. And then one thing, the final thing that you maybe have to consider for quantitative research is that it can be a little bit resource intensive. Okay. Sometimes, it depends on what type of data you use, but sometimes you might have to pay for data to access data. You might have to get some software, things like SPSS or eViews that have some cost attached to it. You might have to, get some statistical assistance from, I think something like StatCon that UJ has. There's a lot of resource demands when it comes to quantitative research. Okay, although this is not a unique thing that is associated with quantitative, I think it's a common theme that you see between quantitative and qualitative. Okay, right. So that was quantitative. I think you can sort of get a sense of, hopefully you can get a sense of the flavor of quantitative research. What's good about it, what is maybe less ideal about it, and how we can address those different things. The next one is qualitative research. Now, some people will say it's the opposite of quantitative research. It is to some extent, but I don't see that as being a negative thing. I think, there are certain problems that are better solved by quantitative approaches, and then there are certain problems that you can better solve with a qualitative approach. Okay, it's not to say that one is better than the other. It's not to say that one is easier than the other one, right? Both of the approaches have the challenges and their advantages, and I think there's a place for both of them. Okay, right. So let's have a look at qualitative research. So there's a definition for you here. Qualitative researchers are interested in the meaning people have constructed, that is, how people make sense of their world and the experiences they have in the world. Okay. The important point here being the meaning people have constructed. How do you get a sense of the meaning that people have constructed? Well, you have to speak to them. You have to maybe have focus groups and sit together. You might have to have a panel of experts if you want to do the Delphi approach. And there's a variety of ways in which you can get a sense of the meaning that people have constructed. Okay, it might be by analyzing literature, if you are doing a systematic review, whatever the case might be. Okay, so the idea here is not like quantitative, where we want to quantify and measure things and look at the associations and relationships. Here we want to think about the underlying meaning, the motivation. We want to make sense of the thought process. So it's a completely different approach. Okay, what's the purpose of qualitative research? It's to gain in-depth insights. So you'll see the emphasis here is detail, complexity, right? We want to gain in-depth insight into people's experiences, behaviors, and the underlying reasons, motivation, and context. Context is very important when it comes to qualitative research. You'll remember from our earlier discussion, for quantitative research, it's structured and systematic. There are some things that we need to simplify, so we will exclude some of the context for the sake of simplification. For qualitative research, that is really the essence of this type of research. The context within which something occurs is very important. Okay. So there are some key characteristics. I'm going to run through them quickly. We have touched on a lot of them before, because this is almost like the opposite of quantitative research. The first key characteristic is that qualitative research is typically exploratory. This is when we don't know a lot about a particular phenomenon. We want to go and see what are the underlying core essences of that, and then after that you might have to do quantitative research to confirm those relationships. But for the most part, qualitative research is exploratory. We use obviously non-numerical data, so this might be text, images, observations, interviews, whatever the case might be. There are a variety of data sources which all are non-numerical. Okay, as I've mentioned before, contextual understanding is very important. So the context within which something occurs is really what we focus on in qualitative research. Then for the more quantitative minded researchers, they will always say, subjectivity of qualitative research is a problem. My view is that, if you are systematic and you are transparent about the way you do your research, then it's not a problem. If you make it easy for the reader to understand your thought process, and you justify your interpretations from literature and just from logic and common sense, I think that sort of reduces the negative impact of subjectivity. Okay, and you would also remember when we spoke about quantitative research, it's not that quantitative research is completely free of subjectivity. There's also a degree of subjectivity, and that is something that is maybe a common characteristic of quantitative and qualitative research, obviously in varying degrees, but there is still some level of interpretation that is required for both types of research. Okay. For qualitative research, we typically have a small purposeful sample, so you're not going to have 10,000 responses. You will only choose a specific focus area where you're going to focus your attention. You're going to really dig into the detail of what's happening there. Okay. The methods are typically flexible. So it's, you'll often see something like semi-structured interviews. So it's where you have a broad structure, but, if something is interesting or the conversation goes in a particular direction, then you can follow that trail. Okay. It's not as highly structured as quantitative research. Okay. It gives us the opportunity to do a really in-depth analysis. So again, as I've said before, the issue here, or the focus here, is really on the detailed insights of people's experiences and perspectives. You really want to look at the detail and the context, get a real sense of what is happening there. Okay. There's a thematic focus. So in other words, what you want to come up with, your product that you deliver at the end would be some kind of themes, patterns, or meanings within the data that you have discovered or constructed. Okay. There's a more holistic perspective. I think this is maybe what makes qualitative research a little bit more difficult. There are so many things that you have to consider if you take everything into context and all of the interconnections. So you really have to almost gain a bit of distance from your research problem and really think deeply about it. Okay. And then, as we've mentioned before, it's sort of a dynamic process. Unlike the very structured procedural way of doing quantitative research, qualitative research is a little bit more dynamic. So you can shift your questions a little bit. You can shift your focus depending on what you see in the data, especially if you approach your research from an inductive approach. Okay. That is a sort of a typical feature of qualitative research. Okay. Now, some benefits of qualitative research. I'm just going to go through this a little bit quicker so we don't run out of time. It gives us an in-depth understanding. Okay, as I've mentioned before, the focus is on the detail, it's on the context. So it really gives us an in-depth understanding of a particular issue or perspective or whatever the case might be. And it has a lot of contextual richness, right? You don't have to stick to things that are only measurable or things that there are only specific secondary data for. You can go and create your own data. Okay. So it really, it can be as contextually rich as you decide and as is relevant to your research problem. There's a lot of flexibility, especially if you are doing exploratory research. You don't know what you don't know. So you need a degree of flexibility so that you can really nudge or guide the research to where it needs to be so that you get the insights that you need. Okay. It enables the exploration of new areas. Obviously, if not a lot is known about a particular topic, then qualitative research is an excellent way to start out. Okay. There's also sort of a human focus of qualitative research, which makes it very well to look at advantages if you want to or just the map existing, but what is the broader value of research?
Hi, Doc.
And
Sorry to interject.
the point is to really know a lot about the topic. The point is not to have an answer for every question.
Sorry, Doc. Just checking if everyone is receiving or can hear Dr. Stratham clearly, or if it's just an issue with our Wi-Fi, just so we can remedy that. Thank you. Apologies for that. I think Dr. Stratham is just having some issues with his Wi-Fi. I'm sure he'll log in soon. So we'll just wait a few minutes if that's okay with everyone. Thank you.
Sorry, guys, it seems like you lost me there. Are you able to see me now? Or hear me now?
Yes, thank you, Doc. We can hear you clearly.
Thank you so much. Thanks. I'm actually at a conference, so I think the tower Wi-Fi is maybe acting up a little bit. Apologies for that. Okay, so let's see. See, like you lost me about 2 minutes ago. Okay, so I think I was busy with the cons of qualitative research. Okay, so just to recap very briefly, what we said was that subjectivity is perhaps one of the drawbacks of qualitative research. Although, as I've mentioned before, I think if you are transparent about your approach and if you are, you know, if you approach your research in a systematic way, then typically the subjectivity isn't really an issue. Okay. There's limited generalizability, but again, that's not the point of qualitative research. The point is not to have an answer for every scenario and every question. The point is to really go into detail about a particular context and to really dig in and see what's happening there. Okay, that is still valuable. You will always be able to relate that to literature, even if it's just to say that you have found something different. So there is always some value that spills over. It doesn't always have to be only generalizability, but you will get to some principles which can inform future research and which gives us an idea of the fundamental uh, um, nature of what we are dealing with. Okay. One advantage that people focus on quite a lot is that qualitative research is very time consuming, right? The process of collecting, analyzing, and interpreting data is time consuming because you have to do interviews, you have to transcribe the data, you have to sit and analyze the findings. I think this is maybe a bit of a misinterpretation because, first of all, there are many, many tools that are now available that makes qualitative data a lot more manageable. If you think about AI-based transcription services, there is a very nice software that's available, things like Atlas TI and in Vivo, which help us to analyze our data. So there's a lot of tools that make it easier um, for you to do qualitative research. If we think about quantitative research, there is a common misunderstanding that quantitative research is quick. You just download your data, run your models, and off you go. And when people do quantitative research, they often find that that is not the case. Sometimes you have to clean data, you have to, put the data in different formats. You have to get the data to talk to each other. So it's perhaps not as quick and easy as people think. And I think qualitative research is not as time consuming as people might think if you use all of the tools available. Okay. It's difficult to replicate. Again, this is, I think, not really a disadvantage. It's just the nature of qualitative research. Um, I don't think this is necessarily a drawback. It's just that, you are focused on the context and on the detail of a particular case. And somebody else might look at it from a different perspective, not necessarily to replicate your study, but just to get a different sense of what's going on. And that is fine. I don't think really the point is for people to exactly replicate your study. I always say to my students who are doing qualitative research, if we have the same data set, I might come up with a bit of a different interpretation of everything than the student, but both of our interpretations are valid if we can substantiate it and if we have done it in a systematic way. Okay. An example that I always give about this is if you go into your average bookshop and you look at the number of books that there are about the Second World War, okay, those studies are not replicating each other. They are further digging into the complexity and the detail of the Second World War and looking at it from different perspectives. And that is how the body of knowledge progresses. Okay, it's not necessarily through replication. The second last one, there's some degree of complexity when it comes to the analysis. Just like with quantitative research, you need a particular set of skills to conduct the analysis, but that is part of your doctoral journey. That is one of the things that you want to establish by doing a doctorate. You want to really establish those skills. Okay, so I would say maybe spend some time when you finish your PhD, make sure that you have the skill set locked down, that you can then carry on with other research. Then it is a lot easier for you because you have established your skill set. Okay. The last one, potential for overload. Okay. I experienced this a little bit in my own PhD. There's so much interesting things and so much data that you sometimes have to really think hard about where to start and where to stop. Okay. There's so many things that you can include. So there is a potential for overload. But I think in that case, if your study is well defined and hopefully your supervisors will also guide you in that sense about how to scope the study and to make sure that it doesn't overwhelm you. Okay. So a well-designed study is a remedy for overload. Okay. Then if we look at I guess more the differences, but if we compare the two broad approaches.
Sorry, Doc. Sorry
Yes.
to interrupt you. I just want to check if you're still presenting the slides, or is it you decided not to due to the Wi-Fi issues, because I'm
Uh,
not seeing anything on my side.
yes. Let me reshare my screen because it's showing on my side.
Oh, apologies for that. Thank you. Thank you. Ah,
Just
it's showing now. Thank you.
are you able to see it now?
Yes. Thank you,
Okay,
Doc.
fantastic. I don't know what happened there. Okay. Nonetheless, I will also share the slides with everybody if you want to run through it again. Okay. So if we look at the bigger picture, the almost like a spectrum from ranging from qualitative on the one side to quantitative on the other side. Let's start with quantitative because that's where we started our discussion, right? So with quantitative research, it's more explanatory. So we look at relationships. We try to explain relationships between different things. It's based in a positivistic approach. It's rooted in observation, and we try to do that as objectively as possible to make some kind of interpretation through the data that we gather. And I think the overall direction that it goes into is nomothetic, which means that generalizability is really the objective. Okay. On the other side of the spectrum, almost the opposite. They are opposites, but not one is not better than the other. The qualitative side leans more towards exploratory, so that is where little is known about a phenomenon. It's interpretive. It's in the interpretive paradigm. So again, your interpretation is really the way that the value is constructed. I always say to my students, if you are doing quantitative research, the mechanism for processing the data is the model, right? You build your model, you put the data into the model, and it gives you some output that you can make sense of. For qualitative research, that mechanism is your brain. You have to put data in your brain and think about it, and then what comes out on the other side is your interpretation of it. Okay. So you can see the differences in approach between these two. And then really the objective is ideographic. So we want to focus on the unique, the detail, the uniqueness of a particular situation, the complexity of it. And if you sort of compare and contrast these two ends of the spectrum, both are valid, both are interesting ways to approach research. It just depends on the type of problem that you're trying to solve. Okay. So you'll see the strongly qualitative approaches are, historical approaches, interviews, and then when you get to surveys and experiments and financial data, it starts to lean more towards the quantitative side of things. Okay. So if you think about your own research problem, the core, the essence of what you're trying to solve, you have to try and locate it on the spectrum. Uh, if it's something that is not a lot known about, if you want to focus on the detail of something, your approach is going to lean more towards qualitative. If you are engaging with an existing body of literature where there are well-established relationships, where you want to go and make an observation and then relate it to the population, have a bit of generalizability, then your approach is going to lean over towards the quantitative side. Okay. Now, mixed methods, this is where we don't quantitative, and we only don't want to have explanatory positivistic type of research. We are going to mix them. Okay. So this is really almost the best of both from quantitative and qualitative. Right. So what's the definition? Mixed methods research integrates both qualitative and quantitative approaches within a single study to provide a comprehensive understanding of research problem. Okay. The purpose then is to combine the strengths of both approaches, allowing for a more complete and nuanced analysis of the research question. I think it's just my view, but I imagine mixed methods approaches would be limited to larger studies, because if you think about doing mixed methods approach in an article, there isn't really enough space for it. But if you do a 200-300 page doctoral thesis, then you actually have space to do different approaches. Okay, so let's look at some key characteristics. What does mixed methods research mean? It combines, as we've mentioned before, qualitative and quantitative research into a single study. I think the driving force behind that, the underlying motivation behind that combination, is that we want triangulation, right? We want to look at a particular thing from different perspectives to make sure that the research that we're doing is valid and reliable, and that is through triangulation. If we do mixed method research, it gives us a more comprehensive understanding, because you are looking at a particular phenomenon from a variety of different perspectives using different methods. Naturally, you will get a more comprehensive understanding of what's going on from a numerical, measurable, quantitative perspective, and from a non-numerical, detailed, interpretive perspective. Okay, so it really combines the strengths of both those approaches. I'll speak a little bit more about this at the end of the presentation, but something that is common of mixed methods research is that there's a particular typology that you can follow. You might have a sequential type of design where you first do your qualitative analysis and then you test it quantitatively, or you might do it at the same time. You just look at it concurrently at a issue from two perspectives. The one doesn't necessarily inform the other one, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. Okay. Complexity, because you're looking at a phenomenon from different perspectives, you have to sort of plan and make sure that you do it right from the start, because you don't want to reach 75% of your research and then realize that it's not really fitting together. So planning is very important when you do mixed method research. Okay, there's some flexibility. That's maybe one of the benefits that qualitative research brings to the picture. You have your very structured quantitative approach, and then the qualitative aspect, you can make it a little bit more flexible depending on what you're trying to achieve. Okay. You can have broad research questions. It can include aspects of exploration or explanation, because you are bringing in the quantitative and the qualitative perspective. It is resource intensive, as all academic research is. So I don't think this is necessarily something to worry about. It's obviously it's part of the challenges of research that you need to solve. I think that's also part of the skill set that you develop from a doctoral study, that you need to think about and solve those research challenges that you have. And then I guess the last key characteristic is that we have enhanced insights because, again, we are looking at a phenomenon from different perspectives. Okay. Right. I think the pros and cons, we've touched on most of them. It gives us a comprehensive perspective. There's triangulation, as we have said. We have some flexibility. We have rich data because we have, numerical and non-numerical approaches. So there's really a lot of, advantages, I guess. It's almost like I said before, the best of both worlds, the best of quantitative and qualitative that gets amalgamated when you do mixed methods. The cons, or maybe the disadvantages or drawbacks, is the complexity. As I've said before, you really need to plan and make sure that there's some underlying logic and structure to your study, because because oftentimes the one aspect, let's say the quantitative part will inform the qualitative part, or the qualitative aspect of your study will have some bearing on the quantitative part. So yeah, it can be a little bit complex. Time consuming perhaps is another disadvantage, because you don't have to now only do a statistical model, you have to go and do some, let's say, qualitative analysis as well. So it's almost, you have to divide your attention between two of those different ways of doing research, which can be time consuming and also resource intensive, as we've seen before. It also has, maybe a bit of a challenge in terms of skills requirements, because you have to be able to do qualitative and quantitative research. Okay, again, as I've said before, whether you're doing a master's or PhD, the idea is for you to establish your skill set. So that is maybe a challenge associated with mixed methods, but it can also be an advantage if we think about it like that, because you gain a broader skill set through doing mixed method research. Okay. Some data integration challenges, that's something to think about. If you integrate, or if you want to bring together sets of data that are not really compatible with each other, they might have to do with the same phenomenon, but the way that they are structured is very different from each other. Okay, so it might be the case that they don't really speak to each other. It gives you conflicting results. That might be a bit of a challenge. And then the last con or disadvantage perhaps is the potential for dilution, especially for qualitative research. It takes many, many pages and a lot of detail to really get to the core of something. Now, if you have to split your attention, your pages that you have available in your study between qualitative and quantitative, it might happen that you don't give either of them the detailed, comprehensive attention that they deserve. And so your approach then becomes a little bit diluted and a little bit thin. Okay. Again, I think if it's well designed and systematic, then that would sort out most of these issues that you see here. Okay. Now, the typology that I mentioned before, you can have sequential mixed methods research or concurrent. So you will see, if you weight it equally, we have a strong qualitative component that happens first, and that informs a strong quantitative component. Or it might be the other way. You have a quantitative component, so you have maybe some kind of statistical analysis, and that informs qualitative. So afterwards, you could take the results and have interviews about it and see, what is people's interpretation of that. If it's unequal, perhaps you have, let's say, perhaps a large component of qualitative where you do interviews and focus groups, and then you have a smaller, perhaps, statistical analysis. Maybe if you do sort of a quantitative content analysis, something like that. Or it might be the other way around. So you can see there's a variety of ways in which you can set up your study. If it's concurrent meaning simultaneous, happening at the same time, you have equally weighted quant and qual approaches in your study that work towards the same goal but are not necessarily connected in that they inform each other. So if it's sequential, the results from one part of your study will inform or drive the other part of the study, whereas for concurrent, they are moving towards the same end goal, but not necessarily a direct connection between them. Okay. And then obviously unequal concurrent is where you have different weightings for the different approaches. But yeah, hopefully this makes sense. I think, especially if you're designing a mixed method type of study, this is a handy way to think about it. Just to think about how you're going to approach it, how you're going to structure it, and just to keep an eye on the overall process. Okay, so how do you make a choice about your methodological approach? I think, obviously the discussion that we have had so far with the advantages and disadvantages and the key characteristics, hopefully all of that will give you a bit of a sense of, when quantitative research is appropriate, when qualitative research is appropriate, what are the benefits and disadvantages, what are the reasons why you might engage in a particular type of research. Okay, in my experience, I think for masters and PhD, a good place to start is looking at other theses and dissertations. Typically what we do, if you start looking at a topic, you jump onto Wikipedia, you get a sense maybe of the broad trends in a particular topic. And then naturally what happens, maybe because of your supervisor giving you a reading list or whatever, we jump into academic articles. And remember, I don't know if this is something that everybody thinks about, but academic articles are written for experts. It's written for a particular audience. So what am I trying to say? In an academic article, many things are left unsaid. So the writing style, the approach, the level of detail of an academic article is not the same as a dissertation. So there might be a lot of things that happen in an academic article that is not explicitly mentioned, not made clear. Okay. So a starting point is looking at other dissertations and theses. Okay. Now you'll see on the screen there are two places you can do that. The first one is OATD.org, that stands for Open Access Theses and Dissertations. If you receive the slides from the RCD, you can just click on the link and it will take you to that website. I'll show you what it looks like in a minute. And then if you go through the UJ databases, you also have the option to use ProQuest theses and dissertations. Okay. Those are two very good databases or search engines to help you find masters and doctoral dissertations and theses, to have a look at what they are doing. Okay, I think it's a really handy way to sort of benchmark your study. Remember, when you are designing a study, it has to be situated in the literature and also in the common approach of your field. So it's a good idea to have a look at other theses and to see, are they doing this quantitatively or qualitatively? Is mixed methods a common thing? Look for studies that you can take ideas from. Maybe you want to do a mixed method study and you want to take one approach from one study and another approach from another study and combine them to make a mixed method study for yourself. Okay. So I'll just, let's see, go to my browser. So hopefully you're able to see this, but open access theses and dissertations. This is the first one, OATD. So you can really jump in here and go and search for keywords. Let's say if you take an example from my own research, stock exchange history. Let's see what it gives us. Okay, So here we have, from something from Monash, essays on the Indian stock market, an investigation of informal efficiency on the JSE. It tells you which university. Typically, you can just click on the URL and it will show you the particular dissertation thesis. The impact of macroeconomic variables on the stock market of all the exporting countries. So what we do here is we slowly go through this and look for examples of something that is similar to what we want to do. Okay. Your supervisors might have a different approach, but I think this is quite a handy way to get a sense of what needs to be done. If you find 3 or 4 or 5 good comparable studies and you look at the structure and you look at the approach, quantitative or qualitative mixed method, you look at the writing style, you look at the way that the research question is formulated, and if you almost take the best aspects of all of those studies and combine them, that really, I think, puts you in a good place to commence with your study. ProQuest works in a similar way. I tried it a little bit earlier, but I think because of the fact that I'm not on campus, I'm struggling to log into ProQuest. But I think if you go through the university library website, you should be able to access the ProQuest thesis and dissertation. So you can enter your search terms, stock market history, whatever the case is, and then you just limit the search to dissertations and theses. And then it will give you a whole host of different dissertations and theses that you can have a look at. Okay. So have a look at those websites. There's a whole vast wealth of theses and dissertations out there, which you can use as a good starting point to design your study as well. Okay. Just some principles to consider as we wrap up. How do you decide whether to use qualitative, quantitative, or mixed method? The first thing that you need to think about is the nature of the question. Typically, if we want to understand why or how questions, we will go to qualitative research. We want to dig into the deeper meaning of things. Okay. If we have what questions or how much or measurable type of questions, we would lean more towards quantitative research. If we want to combine why with what questions, so the detail of a particular thing and then the statistical relationship associated with that, then you would move more towards mixed method research. The second aspect that you need to consider is the type of data that you need. For qualitative, it's in-depth descriptive data. If that is the type of data that you have access to or that you are interested in, then you will move more towards qualitative research. If the data that you are, that you have available, or the data that you are interested in is more numerical, more statistical type of, data, it would lean more towards a quantitative study. If you want to bring in descriptive and numerical measurable aspects into your study, then that lends itself to mixed methods. Okay, and then the third aspect, your research goal. If your goal is to explore new things and generate insights, then qualitative is your way to go. If you want to test and perhaps extrapolate and predict things, then quantitative is the way to go. And if you want to integrate those perspectives and triangulate your findings, then mixed method is perhaps the way that you can approach that. Okay. Thank you so much for your interest. Thank you for attending the workshop. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to share it with me. You can see my email on the screen. I am happy for you to reach out to me as well if there's something that I can assist you with. And I want to wish you all the best with your research. Don't forget to enjoy it. I know it's a lot of pressure if you do postgrad research, but don't let it go by you. Have conversations with people. Use it as an excuse to network with people and enjoy it. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Stradom, for that very insightful presentation. We do have a few questions in the chat, in the question and
Yes,
answer chat, if you
sure.
can just refer to that.
I'll just
I
have a
think
quick
the
look.
earliest one is from James, where he asked to briefly take him back to the Venn diagram. If we could please do that. Thank you.
Let's see. Okay, it seems like the one from James is first. Briefly take me back to the Venn diagram, please. Just share my screen again. James, I think you're referring to this one. So I'll share this with you. This is more of the thought process behind academic research. This is typically not something that you will discuss in your thesis, but it is more a way for you to think about how to scope and structure your research. It has to have some bearing on everyday life. It has to be rooted in scientific observation, and then the science behind the science must also be sound. You have to have good scientific principles that you apply. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. Then let's see. The other one, also from James, says, thanks for the presentation. How has technological advancements affected or influenced the traditional qualitative and quantitative research methods over the past decade? I think the major development there is the introduction of AI. The way that we have done, particularly qualitative research, actually both of them, qualitative and quantitative research, was static for a long time. Whether you did it on a Excel or by hand, if you still did um, regression calculations by hand, which is something that people did at some point, and whether you did it with Excel, whether you did it with EVs, whether you did it with some kind of statistical package, I think it remained relatively static until the introduction of AI. Okay, for qualitative research, you now have AI-driven capabilities in Atlas TI, for example, where there's AI coding. So that is where your data gets sent off to one of the AI large language models, and you get a sort of analysis done by the AI model to give you the most prominent themes that emerge from your data. There's a lot of AI-driven capabilities that are coming out now. Only recently, I only started seeing them from about late last year. For quantitative research, it's pretty much the same thing, especially with a lot of statistical approaches. If you use the more advanced quantitative statistical, packages, there is some degree of model specification and programming that's involved. And now what people are starting to realize is, the latest ChatGPT model, for example, 4.0 is very good with that. It's very good with programming and with model specification and things like that. So I think that is happening a little bit more commonly nowadays, that people are relying on AI tools to assist their research. If it's done responsibly, I think that it is okay. But then also you have to be careful. You still have to take responsibility for the output. You can't say, oh, the AI made a mistake, so it's not my problem. It's still your responsibility to make sure that the outputs and the interpretation and the process is correct and transparent. Okay. Then another one from Topiwa. It says, well, what is your opinion on the view that at PhD level, it is not adequate to use only one method for data collection, only interviews? Is it always the case that one has to have more than one method? So Tapio, my view is, I think the core principle is that a PhD study has to be fairly substantial. Okay. The way that you get there is a different question. I don't think all PhD has to have mixed methods. you know. So combination of quantitative and qualitative. I don't think all PhDs need to have two different methods, whether both of them are quantitative or both are qualitative. It's just the depth of your analysis. I almost think the more important thing is, that's what distinguishes a master's from a PhD, is that your PhD has a stronger grounding in theory. You have a theoretical or a conceptual framework, which is sometimes not the case with a master's study. Okay. I mean, I'm just taking an example out of my own life, but if I think of my own PhD, I only did qualitative analysis. I did a historical analysis, but on a substantial amount of data. I covered a 60-year period of the stock exchange development. So I don't think in that case it's necessary then for me to go and do a quantitative analysis, because it defeats the purpose. It doesn't fit into the study. Yeah, so I don't have a perfect answer for you, Tapiwa. I think almost the best answer I have for you is to look at comparable PhD studies and justify your approach from benchmarking it with those other studies. If everybody's doing it a particular way, then you can say, okay, I'm going to do it the same way. If everybody is doing, more than one method or mixed method, whatever the case might be, then it might be something to consider, because there might be a reason for that. I just want to check the chat as well. It looks like there's one from Cecilia, who says, if I have opted for mixed method, what research design will suit my study? Okay, so mixed method implies that you will have a combination of, you have two different methodologies. You have qualitative, quantitative. You will then design each leg of your study, each aspect of your study, according to the approach. So I don't think there's necessarily a correct answer for your question. It will be a combination, right? So you might have statistical analysis, and then you do interviews about the results, or you might do interviews or focus groups or some kind of documentary analysis, whatever the case is, to establish some relationships, and then afterwards go and test it statistically. So yeah, there's a million ways in which you can do that. Again, I think, Cecilia, the important thing is that you have a look at comparable studies, and particularly at a doctoral level. You can look at articles as well, naturally. The articles are still the most trustworthy source. So articles play a very important role. But if we neglect to look at, doctoral thesis, then you kind of miss out on a lot of the message, because a lot of the academic development happens during that phase. Okay, doesn't seem like there are more questions. If you think of more questions, there's something you want to further explore, you're more than welcome to email me. I think, my email address will be on the slides as well. So when you get that, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining. I had a fantastic time chatting to you this morning. I hope you enjoyed it too. I hope you have some clarity on which way you want to go. If you don't stress. If you ask the psychologists, they will say, or the neuroscientists, they will say a lot of things happen in your brain while you are asleep. So sometimes you just have to think, and you have to give it a bit of time. Then the answer comes to you when you are ready for it. Okay, so I wish you all the best. Good luck with your research pursuits, and hopefully I will bump into you in the next workshop. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stradham, for that presentation. If there are any more questions, like Dr. Stradham said, you can either contact him directly, or we'll give you 30 seconds to maybe post something in the chat. If not, or in the meantime, rather, I'd like to encourage all of the attendees, if they could please fill out the feedback form. I've posted it in the chat, and I'll repost the link as well. We really appreciate your feedback, and it's quite necessary for us to determine how to improve our services in the future. So we'll just give it another 20 seconds. If there are no more questions, then we will close the session. Thank you. Okay, it doesn't look like there's any questions. So with that, we'd like to close the session. Thank you once again, Dr. Stratham. Greatly appreciated for all of your hard work in this presentation, and I wish you all a good day. Have a good day.
Thanks
Thank
so
you very
much. Thanks
much.
for having me. Have a
Bye.
good day. Yes, everyone.